This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to provide students with some help getting started in their first lesson in Latin Grammar 1. On your screen here you can see the textbook that we're going to be studying in Latin Grammar 1 in the Academy. The title is Gildersleeve's Latin Grammar, and this is an important textbook because it's what's called a reference grammar. It's a reference grammar, and what that means is that it's a grammar textbook that you can use for reference for the rest of your life. So if you decide to commit yourself to classical language studies and end up studying Latin and Greek in the future, when you have questions about any Latin language, any Latin grammar or translation work, this book will very likely have all of the information that you need. Having said that, it also has way more information than you need to actually learn to read and translate Latin. So as we go through this study, I'll walk through each lesson with you, and I'll help you to see what the important content is that you need to really master and what you should consider just to be reference information. So this is a book that you can really invest your time in studying and then continue to use it for the rest of your life. I began studying this book when I was in college as a teenager, and I continue to use it today when I'm doing translation work or when I come into a passage in Latin where there's something that I can't understand. I'll pull out a copy of Gildersleeve's Grammar and look up the topics that might explain what the problem is, and in most cases I find the explanation in this grammar. So I want you to understand that Gildersleeve's Latin Grammar is a reference grammar. It has way more information than we'll need to begin reading Latin fluently, but it's a book that you can study and make use of for the rest of your life. And we do the same thing in classical Greek, where we use another reference grammar for our studies. So again, Gildersleeve's Latin Grammar, you can see the author is B.L. Gildersleeve. He was a Greek professor at Johns Hopkins University, which is a great university. So we've got a reliable source here, and this book was written back in the early 1900s. And at that time, classical studies were still very strong in modern universities. So it's a great time period for source materials, and some people refer to this book as Gildersleeve and Lodge. So anyway, know the textbook that we're using, understand the nature of this textbook, that it's a reference grammar, and then, as I said, in each of the lessons, I'll help you to see what the important information is for your studies in Latin grammar, so you can focus on that and master it, but then you can continue to use this book as a reference in the future. So let's go ahead and scroll down here to the table of contents. Just ignore this preface. Get down to the table of contents here, and we'll see the divisions of this grammar book. You see the first part is etymology, and actually it starts with orthography. This first lesson on letters and syllables is what we call orthography in grammar. It's the first part of grammar. And then we actually move to etymology when we start and study the parts of speech. So the study of the parts of speech and all of their forms is what etymology refers to. So part one, orthography and etymology. We go through all of the parts of speech, learn about all of their forms and meanings, and then we come to the second major division of grammar, which is syntax. So you can see part two starts here. We start learning the rules of construction, so simple sentence rules. We go on to more expanded rules on sentences. We then get into compound or more complex sentences, where sentences are made up of different parts. Study the syntax of compound sentences, and then we get into a little bit of figures of speech and have a summary of the rules of syntax at the end of that section. The third section of grammar is prosody, which has to do with studying poetry, meter, rhyme, things like that, proper accent of words, figuring out how to read a line of poetry properly, and so on. So we'll study prosody in Latin Grammar 3, and you can see the topics here. Quantity, that means how to identify whether syllables are long and short, so that you can figure out how to read them correctly and also how to accent them correctly. Different figures or forms of prosody, and then versification, which is how poetry is actually composed in Latin. Now, we're not going to be composing any sentences or composing any poetry, but when you study the science of syntax and prosody, it allows you to work backwards in translation, to start with something that was written in Latin and use the rules of syntax and prosody to go backwards from what is written to what the author intended to write, to understand the mind of the author. So we're not interested in composition ourselves, but we're interested in learning the art of grammar so that we can use it to understand exactly what is being written or spoken by past authors in Latin. So these are the three main parts of grammar: etymology, syntax, and prosody, all covered in this textbook. And in Latin Grammar 1, 2, and 3, we're simply going to study the content of this entire book. So having said that, we're going to move on now and get started with our first lesson here, article number 1, and you can see the topic is the alphabet. Now I'm going to move quickly in these videos because unlike a classroom, you as a student have the ability to stop, replay, watch a video as many times as you want. You have control over the content of the lesson, of the things that I explained. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time reviewing things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time repeating things because you can control that yourself. So if it seems like I'm moving quickly, just hit pause, back up, and listen to it again. I'd like to try to keep these videos as short as possible and leave control over review to you. So just follow along. Lesson 1 in Latin Grammar 1, we study the alphabet. And you can see in Article 1, we have the alphabet, the Latin alphabet presented to us here in uppercase letters. Notice it teaches us that the Latin alphabet has 23 letters. So the first thing you should ask when you look at the Latin alphabet, you should ask what English letters are missing in the Latin alphabet. And if we read these, let's just read it with English letter names. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, we see J is missing. Okay, so J is the first letter that's missing. K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, we see that U is missing. V, we see W is missing. And then we have X, Y, Z. So 3 letters are missing: J, U, and W. That's the difference between the Latin and the English alphabet. Okay, the letters J, U, and W. And we're going to learn about these missing letters in these notes down here. Note, if you can, that the main rule, the main focus of each section is written in larger print. And then underneath that larger print, remarks, notes, comments, etc. are written in smaller print. So you can see here in Lesson 1, the real lesson is in the largest print. Then we've got some remarks in smaller print. And then we've got a note in even smaller print. So use the size of the font to help guide your study, and understand that the largest print is the most important, and you're going to get into more and more details that really become less important for you as a beginning Latin student. They'll be in smaller font. All right, so the main rule for Article 1 is this simple rule that the Latin alphabet is 23 letters, and this list of the Latin letters. Now in the remarks here, we've got some helpful information, and then in the note, very helpfully, we have a list of the actual names of the letters. So here we have the names of the letters, and we'll look at that in a minute. Let's just go through these remarks. The first remark says, the sounds represented by the letters ke and ka, that's how you pronounce these letters in Latin, ke and ka, or ke and kappa, the sounds represented by these two letters were originally distinct. They were different. The letter ke had the sound of ge, but they gradually approximated each other. That is, they gradually started to sound more and more like each other until ke finally supplanted ka, except in a few words. So we see that back in ancient history and early Latin, these letters had different sounds, but over time they simplified and one replaced the other. You should know that in Latin, normally today, when we see the letter ka, it's simply the Greek kappa. It's usually seen in words that Latin has taken from Greek, and those original Greek words had the Greek letter kappa in them, and that kappa is kept in Latin with the letter ka. So that's where we normally see the letter ka in Latin, in words taken from Greek. Okay, so the first remark is simply an explanation of the change in the pronunciation of ke and ka over time in Latin. Now, the reason these historical notes are important is because if you do get serious about Latin studies, you're going to study Latin that was written at different periods of history. And when you try to figure out what's going on in the Latin, you have to understand when the Latin was written. Latin that's written, let's say, in the Middle Ages, let's say by Thomas Aquinas in 1200 AD, that Latin sounded and looked different than the Latin that was spoken and written in ancient Rome. And when we read different works, we have to read them in their historical context. So understanding the historical developments of the language helps us when we read Latin from different historical periods. So don't think this is just a bunch of trivia. It's not a bunch of useless information. When you read different authors, if those authors come from different periods, it's good to be aware of the differences in their language because it will help you to understand and translate more effectively. All right, that's remark number one. The sounds represented by ke and ka. Remark number two. We can refer to this letter as J just by its English name because it's obviously not included in the alphabet here. So let's just call this J. And notice what it is. It's the consonantal form of the vowel E. The Latin name for this vowel is E. In English it would be I, but in Latin it's E. The letter J, the symbol that we call J, is simply the consonant form of the vowel E. And it dates from the Middle Ages. That means the Romans never used it. The Romans never used this symbol. This is a symbol that started to be used by Christian era writers in the Middle Ages. So after 500 AD, which is when the Middle Ages begin. So that's why the letter J is not included in the alphabet. It developed later and it was used as a consonantal form of E. What does that mean, consonantal form? Well, when the vowel E is found, let's say, at the beginning of a word, and it's followed by another vowel, it has the effect of a consonant. So it's like a consonant, and I'll give you an example. Very simply, the name of our Lord, which in English is spelled with a J and pronounced Jesus, in Latin is Jesu, Jesu. So if we think about that, we have the letter E, the Latin letter E at the beginning of the name, followed by another vowel, E. When we pronounce that, ye, that first E, that first vowel, actually acts like the consonant Y, as we say yes, Y-E-S, and we call Y a consonant. That letter E acts just like the English letter Y, so it acts like a consonant. And in the Middle Ages, when that vowel E was used like that at the beginning of a word, they changed the form in writing and wrote it as what we call the letter J. So the letter J is not really a Latin letter. It's just a symbol that's used to show the consonantal use of the vowel E. Right? That's where the J comes from. Never used in ancient Rome, never used by ancient Latin writers, was developed in the Middle Ages. So if you see a picture of ancient Rome and you see Julius Caesar written with a J, that's not historical. In real Roman Latin, Julius would start with the vowel E. It would look more like Julius, not like Julius, okay? Just as Jesus would be Jesus, not Jesus, okay? So that's where the J comes from. Next, we read that the letter, which we would call V, V represents also the vowel U in the Latin alphabet. So this letter here that looks like an English V is actually the Latin U. It's the vowel U. And again, this rounded form of the vowel U would never exist in ancient Roman Latin. So we would never see a rounded U inscribed in a Roman building. And if you do a simple Google search for, old Roman buildings or old Roman inscriptions, you'll see that there are no U's written in those inscriptions. The U's look like the letter V. They're pointed and sharp. So the letter V, which looks like a V here, is actually U, the Latin vowel U. And if you see any curved letters that look like the English U, realize that that's not real Latin, okay? Even though later it may have been used in writing or typing. So the letter V actually represents the vowel U in the Latin alphabet. Its resolution into two letters, V for the consonant sound and U for the vowel sound, also dates from the Middle Ages. So that rounded symbol for U was never used until the Middle Ages. Roman Latin always used this symbol that looks like a V for the vowel U. In the Middle Ages, just as with J, Middle Age writers used this symbol to show when the letter U had a consonantal force in the word. So it would be treated like a different letter because it was acting like a consonant. Okay? So again, I know I'm moving through this quickly. You can pause and replay this if you need to as many times as you want to. So if you feel like I'm going quickly, realize it's because you control the ability to review what I've explained. Remark number 3. The letters Y and Z, what we would call Y and Z, which are in Greek actually called, this letter has a number of different names. It can be called Y. It can also be called upsilon after the Greek letter. What we call the letter Z is called the zeta, which is its Greek name. So we have upsilon and zeta, or Y and zeta. If you know Spanish, you'll know that this letter is called Y, which is the same as Y. So we have Y and zeta. These two letters were introduced in the time of Cicero, because Cicero and other philosophers were very interested in Greek studies, and they brought Greek words into Latin. It was used to transliterate the Greek letters upsilon and zeta. So when learned Romans brought Greek words into their language that they wanted to use, they simply kept these letters, upsilon and zeta, and made them Latin letters. So they're not truly Latin letters. They're really Greek letters that were brought into Latin, and that's probably why we see them listed at the end of the alphabet. All right? So upsilon and zeta were introduced in the time of Cicero. Cicero lived from around 100 to around 40 BC. So let's just say 100 BC. These letters came into Latin to transliterate the Greek letters upsilon and zeta into Latin words. In early Latin, upsilon was represented by u, and zeta was represented by a double S, or just by the S. Zeta occurred in the earliest times but had been lost, and its place in the alphabet taken by ge, which was introduced after ke acquired the sound of ka. So you can just see lots of historical information, not stuff that you have to master at this point, but interesting and helpful information for your future studies. Those are the 3 remarks added in comment on article number 1. Now the last note here, which I said is important because it lists for us the actual Latin names of the letters. So you can use this to recite this alphabet. And in this course, it's classical grammar, so I don't recommend you learn only Church Latin. I recommend you learn classical Latin and Church Latin because, as I said before, if you're reading something written by a Roman, you should read it as he would have read it, because that it was written to sound good and to be pronounced easily in his pronunciation, and so you should read it with his pronunciation. If you read something written by Thomas Aquinas or a church father, you should read it with a modernized, what we call ecclesiastical Latin pronunciation. Your pronunciation should change to match that of the author that you're studying. So you need to make sure you learn both the older classical Latin pronunciation as well as the more modern medieval or ecclesiastical Latin pronunciation. And change your pronunciation based on what you're reading, whether it's a classical author or a church author, a more modern or medieval author. So let's look at these names, and we'll practice reading them with classical pronunciation, and then I'll show you how to read them with ecclesiastical pronunciation. The first letter is A, then we read B, then we read K, D, E, F, G. H, I, K, L, M, N, O, P. This is read together as Q, R, S, T, U, X or X. So the letter we call X would be X or X. And then the last 2 letters, upsilon and zeta, or Y and zeta. And we see a note here. These other letters are to be pronounced according to the rules given in Articles 3 and 7, so we'll get to that in a future lesson. For upsilon, the sound of upsilon was used for, the sound was used to name it, so it was just called U, even though the letter is called upsilon. So it can be upsilon or U, or Y, as I said before. And for what we call Z, the Greek name zeta was used. All right, so here we have an explanation of the names of all the Latin letters. So take some time to learn them, match them with the Latin letters, maybe copy them out on a sheet of paper, write the letter and its name. And I just showed you the classical pronunciation. I'll run through it quickly one more time. A, B, K, D, E, F, G, H, I, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, X, upsilon, and zeta, or again, you can just say U. But you see how that creates confusion because we have this letter here written as an English form V that looks like, that represents the U, and then we have also talk about the upsilon. So just keep that clear and realize that we're going to look for those letters in words that are being drawn from Greek, whereas this Latin U is going to be present in many words. Lastly, for ecclesiastical pronunciation, we have A, B, Ch, D, E, F, J. A, B, Ch, D, E, F, J. H, I, K, L, M, N, O, P, QRSTUX, and then you've got zeta. So the only letters that are pronounced different in ecclesiastical Latin would be che and j. Everything else is exactly the same. So the important lesson for lesson 1 or article 1 is that the Latin alphabet has 23 letters, and you see them written out here. Notice there's some confusion between u and upsilon because upsilon is really just a Greek letter. Make sure you keep that clear in your mind. It's explained down here in the remarks, and the names are given in the note at the bottom. If you've got any questions about this lesson after watching this video, you should study the lesson for yourself in detail and see if the questions don't clear themselves up as you study. But if any questions remain, feel free to post those questions on the support forum on the course page. If you post questions there, I can answer them in detail, and then other students may also be able to answer, and other students may be able to learn from the responses. So if you're studying and you have a question, it's likely that other students will have the same question, so post it and give me a chance to get a good answer for you, and you'll also be helping your fellow students when you do that. I hope that's a helpful walk through the beginning of our study of Latin grammar and through this first article. If you've got any questions, post them on the forum, and we'll make our way through Latin grammar together. God bless your studies.